project, and I would say that David is the most knowledgeable person on Muskrat Falls on the planet. So I'd like for you to join with me in thanking him for his work for the province. So I'm going to stick to my original topic, not talk too much about the Muskrat Falls Inquiry report, except to say a few things. What Dave asked me to speak on was a short blog I did, a guest blog I did on Des Sullivan's Uncle Gnarly blog, and it was called Rate Mitigation and Other Delusions. But I want to just say a few words about the Muskrat Falls Inquiry, and I'm sure you've all followed the media reports and read all 1,100 pages of the report, so you're all fully familiar with that. I haven't done all of that, I must admit. My purpose in writing the blog and in speaking to you today was to point out that we don't have just one problem. It's not just rate mitigation. We have two big problems in this province. The focus, public attention has been on rate mitigation, and we seem to forget our fiscal crisis, except when the Auditor General issues her annual report and attempts unsuccessfully to scare us into action. Just one of those problems would be daunting. The two together create the perfect storm for Newfoundland and Labrador. And when I did the interview this morning, Terry Roberts was telling me that Andrew Coyne, who writes a column for the Globe and Mail now, has done one, which I haven't read, but it's focused on the dire straits of Newfoundland. And the argument is that the biggest problem for Canada is not Alberta. The biggest problem for Canada is Newfoundland. Only 500,000 people, but there's a lot of money involved here. So I wanted to focus first on the delusion of rate mitigation. A reasonable and stable electricity rates are important for two reasons. First of all, we have a lot of low-income families in Newfoundland, so we need to ensure that power rates are affordable for them. And we need to keep our electricity rates low, as low as possible, because if we don't, people are going to flee from the electrical system. They're going to make changes, and demand is going to go down, prices are going to have to go up, and we're just making a bad situation worse. Now, for some reason, and perhaps it was foolhardy on the part of the province, we were invited, Dave and I were invited to the joint federal provincial press conference on rate mitigation to announce the federal contribution. And on the way in, we met a former colleague of ours, former senior public servant, who will remain unnamed, who had actually seen the details of the report. And he said to us, you're going to be, Dave and Ron, you're going to be underwhelmed. And we were. As you all know, there was really nothing substantive in the announcement. Following that, Dave and I were offered a meeting with senior public servants on the framework announced at the press conference. And that was useful, and that was several weeks ago. And since then, Dave and I have written a number of letters to the officials to ask them for additional information. They've gone silent. They will not respond to us at all. And that's been a continual theme in terms of our involvement with the project and other issues through the last number of years. So what we heard at the press conference was the potential for rejigging the financial arrangements for the project and moving it towards a traditional cost of service project, which Dave knows much more about than I. The effect of that will be to reduce the overall cost over the life of the project. That's true, but it has a perverse impact of increasing the requirements in the early years, which means the rate mitigation problem is worsened, at least in the early years. And the second thing is that they talked about monetizing revenues that might come down the road and taking that cash up front for rate mitigation. But I don't believe there are going to be any dividends down the road. So who in their right mind would pay for a potential flow of income down the road? It's just not going to happen. The only people who would be foolish enough to do that would be the federal government. Now, in addition, the Public Utilities Board was asked to provide advice on potential rate mitigation initiatives. based on what we think are low assumptions about the revenue requirements, which will have to be provided in order to pay for Muskrat Falls. The board identified a gap of $400 million between what they estimated they could raise with the initiatives they thought of in order to keep rates at 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which is pretty close to what we're paying now. And I want to make a number of points about that gap of $400 million. First of all, the revenues estimated by the Public Utilities Board are estimates. They're estimates only. We don't know if they're going to be accomplished or not. The bulk of the revenues will have to come from the so-called dividends, which are going to come from the project. And you've heard a lot about dividends, and Ed Martin has always been talking about these tens of billions of dollars of dividends that are going to come to us. It's all nonsense. It's important to remember that the dividends, such as they are, and if they ever come about, have to come from us. They don't come out of thin air. They have to come from what we pay for electricity. So the dividends, if there are any, will come from one pocket, and then they'll be put in your other pocket on the other side of your trousers. We're no farther ahead. Oh. Technical difficulties. Try that now. And in order to can you hear me now, still on the back? Yeah. So in order to create these dividends, rates are going to have to increase by 3.5% a year. That doesn't sound much every year, but if you're continuing on and on and on and on and on, you can see over, a decade, that's going to be a lot more cost of electricity. And we've been used to very stable electricity rates over the last years, and we've gotten used to that. The second thing is that they told us that the estimates for future demand of electricity have been revised downward from the very optimistic assumptions on which Muskrat Falls was based. And we've asked them for those changed estimates, and they won't give it to us. They won't even respond to our emails, which is very unfortunate. You'd think by now we'd realize that we need to get this stuff out and to have accurate information, but for some reason, even the present government, who weren't responsible for this project, will not do that. Third, it's highly unlikely that the cost estimates for the project will be in fact accurate. And I know Stan Marshall is going out saying it's going to be $12.7 billion. I just don't believe it. There are a number of court cases and arbitrations, a particularly large one with Astaldi. But the big problem is the delays in the commissioning of the project. And so we have the software issues, which you've all heard about, and the synchronous condenser, whatever that is. But we know it's important for the operation of the line, and there's no real indication as to when either of these issues are going to be resolved. In addition, we know that the first turbine hasn't worked properly, and I know for a fact that it hasn't been fixed yet. So the problem with that is interest during construction. We have to pay, including the capital costs, the interest payments on the debt that we've borrowed for this project. And that amounts to $500 million a year. So if the project is delayed another year, that has to add another $500 million to the cost of the project. So that's a big problem. The question of reliability became an issue, particularly after Dark NL, and Dave and I urged the Public Utilities Board to expand their review of Dark NL to look at post-Muskrat Falls reliability, and we were supported by Light and Power, and they agreed to do that. And they brought that in now to a further initiative to look at the reliability issues. It's clear to, and this is not from me, this is from the board's consultant, Liberty Consultant, who have been right all along on this. And they feel that there's going to have to be a source of power on the Avalon Peninsula. Otherwise, we're going to be facing, and this is coming from Liberty Consulting, we're going to be facing the potential loss of power, not just for days or weeks or months. The other thing is, it's good to be connected to the to Nova Scotia. But the problem with that is the line only has a limited amount of capacity. I think it's 300 megawatts of power. That's not going to be enough to meet our needs. And when we lose power, it's likely to be around this time of year. And it's going to be at the time when they have high consumption of power in Nova Scotia and the rest of the maritime provinces. We know that there are no agreements with Emera to provide that backup power. And so one thing that I've done is I have no confidence in the reliability of the system. So I've installed a backup generator, and I've got 2 big propane tanks, and we're good for weeks. And I'm sure Stan Marshall has a much bigger one than mine, and does his own house. Because Stan has talked about, well, you're going to have to balance cost versus reliability, but nobody's going to be prepared to lose their electricity for weeks and weeks on end. We just can't do that. People won't survive. People will die. You just can't have that. So this is going to cost, meeting reliability issues is going to cost a lot of money. And the alternatives are either refurbishing the existing thermal plant at Holyrood, and there's a proposal called out now to determine what the cost of that might be. And any estimate, we should look at that estimate with a grain of salt, that's for sure. We should know that by now. The other option is gas turbines. And I'm told that that's another $1 billion in capital costs in order to do that, to ensure reliability. Where's the money going to come from to do that? We're only 500,000 people. It's going to be very tough. And we also need to remember that the backup that we need to have forever. We're always going to have that backup power, because the main consumption of electricity is really the Northeast Avalon. And there's been a lot of population inflow from the rest of the province. So the result of that is the gap that we have is far more than $400 million. And we're a long ways from finding the pot at the end of the rainbow, which will allow us to keep rates at the target rate of 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And we need to be honest about that, and we need to understand that. Rate mitigation is very important, as I said at the beginning, because if ratepayers have no confidence that rates are not going to double, they are going to start to abandon the use of electricity to the extent that they can. I'm told that you have people from downtown St. John's now going to places where they can go during the day in order to keep their furnaces down or turn off their thermostats. Just think what that's going to be like if electricity doubles. It's going to be very, very difficult for us. So there is a piece of good news, and that is that we've got one really big card to play, and that's the federal loan guarantee. Dave and I and others warned the federal government right at the beginning of this project that they should not go ahead with this project until it had a full regulatory review by the Public Utilities Board, and we were ignored. So the federal government is complicit in this project, but the thing is, there's something concrete behind that complicity, because they've guaranteed the loan, and if we can't pay it, then they're going to have to step up and pay it. The key thing about the loan guarantee is that it's what's called non-recourse to the province. So the project can fail, but it doesn't come back on the taxpayers of the province, and that's a very important thing. That's similar, I was thinking the other day, I've been around a long time, that one of the great things that the late John Crosby did is before he crossed the floor and he was with Smallwood, is that the Come-by-Chance refinery, there was, I believe, a proposal to increase the size of the Come-by-Chance refinery. And previously, under the existing refinery, the province guaranteed the loan. And when they went to try to refinance to increase the size of the refinery, John Crosby and I believe Clyde Wells managed to get that provision taken out. And it turned out that of course, Come-by-Chance went bankrupt. And it was the largest bankruptcy in Canadian history at that point, but we weren't responsible as a province. And that's true of Muskrat Falls as well. So I don't think that the current approach to rate mitigation will work. And I think we need to think about much more radical approaches which take advantage of the federal loan guarantee. Now, I'm not suggesting that that the project go bankrupt, but it is, I've been involved in very sensitive federal provincial negotiations and other negotiations. We have to recognize the cards that we have, and that is a very big card, because the last thing the federal government wants to see happen is to see this project go bankrupt, and perhaps also the province as well. So what I think has to happen is we have to, and Dave particularly has been developing this idea, we've got to start to convince the federal government to convert that loan guarantee into equity into the project. What we need to do is to bring them in as the co-owners of the project. And that was the way that the Lower Churchill was supposed to be developed. There was a Lower Churchill Development Corporation established, 51% province, 49% federal government. And that legislation is still on the books, but it wasn't used, unfortunately, for this project. So whether it's all the debt or a portion of it, has got to be converted by the federal government into equity into the project. Because, let's face it, folks, we cannot afford to pay for that project. We can't afford to pay the kinds of rates that would be required in order to accomplish that. But the unfortunate thing about all of this is that we've borrowed, again, outside for the project costs, but the province has borrowed almost $4 billion for our, quotes, equity into the project. And we're going to lose that equity. We're not going to be able to pay for it. There's not going to be dividends sufficient from the project in order to pay that debt off. What means that we can't get out of that debt. That debt is going to be part of the obligations that we as taxpayers have. It was meant to be paid for by dividends from the project, but these dividends are illusory. They will never happen. So, as I said, we have, how am I doing for time, Dave? Good? 15 minutes. So, I want to, as I said, there's one part to it, one delusion, there's rate mitigation. The next delusion is how we see our fiscal situation. And what I most despair about is that the people who should know better, and I think particularly of like the university administration, they seem to be blind to our fiscal situation, even when our Auditor General gives a report and tells us that our level of expenditure is unsustainable, and in our own diplomatic way tells us that a return to surplus in a few years is yet another fantasy. So a few tidbits from her most recent report. Most of you probably know this, but I'll just go through them quickly. Our net debt is $15.4 billion. Think of that, the highest in our history. Our net debt per capita is almost $30,000 per person, so each of us here has $30,000 in debt. Our net debt as a percentage of our gross domestic product is 46.3%. It's almost 50%. Significantly higher than the provincial average of less than 25%. So we're double. That's just incredible. We've had a 33% increase in expenditures over the last 10 years, but our revenues have gone down by 9%. Just listen to this. We have the highest per capita revenues in the country, but of course our expenditures are the highest as well. So we're dreaming if we think we're going to get equalization anytime soon, because we're a long ways from that. Our problem is that we haven't properly managed our revenues. And we have the highest tax rates in the country. And I noticed there was a conference on our economic prospects a couple of weeks ago, and a professor in the political science department made a comment that we had lots of tax room in this province. And it's just not there. It's not true. We are a very low income province by and large. So the Auditor General said that in order to produce, the target is to have a balanced budget in 2023. It's an absolute fantasy. because we would have to increase our expenditures by almost 2% a year, and that's a lot of money. And what are the chances of us doing that when we've increased expenditures by 1.3% a year over the past 4 years? They're slim to none. And even with all that, we see announcements of new programs every day in this province. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. For example, it's been reported that God love them, NAPE has negotiated a 4% increase in their salaries. So if you look at, and everybody else is going to get that 4%, and of course you've got the doctors out there, I mean, they're going to extract as much as they can from us, and that's another issue. And in addition, a couple of weeks ago, and Kevin, don't tell your brother that I said this, but we've announced that we're going to be preparing a bid for the 2015 Canada Summer Games. We've got to focus on our needs, not our wants, over the next couple of years. We're facing a very, very difficult period. And just now turning to the report of the Parliamentary Budget Office. And it won't surprise you to hear that they've confirmed that we are a basket case. We are just behind Manitoba and Saskatchewan in terms of our fiscal sustainability, and require a lot of decreases in public expenditure to make us whole. And I happen to know as a fact, because I actually talked to the author of the first report on sustainability several years ago, and I said, well, did you consider the impact of Muskrat Falls? Well, no. So it's even without Muskrat Falls, we're in a very difficult situation. And one of the key drivers in all this, which we share with other provinces, but we're at the beginning of all this, is our demographics. So we're the oldest population in Canada. And as George Tilley would know, that imposes tremendous costs on our healthcare system. So far I've avoided imposing any costs on the healthcare system except for being born here. I've only been in the hospital once. But that's probably about to change unless I can. I always tell my wife my objective is to die of a massive stroke on the tennis court, but I don't know if I will accomplish that or not. So, in addition, the other indications are very poor too in terms of our economy. So, the reason why we've increased spending so much is oil and gas, and of course, but oil and gas is both a blessing and a curse, because we have spent the revenues we've got from oil and gas on the basis that oil prices are going to be over $100 a barrel, and it's going to continue forever. So we ratcheted our expenditures up. And someone, I can't remember who, I think it was the APEC did a little analysis. And if we had increased our level of expenditures at the same average as the maritime provinces, guess what? We'd have a $10 billion heritage fund in the province. But we've got nothing to show for it. Now, I recognize there are a lot of needs and demands in the province. There's no question about that. And but, folks, we've got to start to control our expenditure, or we're done for. So at a certain point, we're going to see, and probably the only reason why we have the credit rating that we have is because we're a province in Canada, and Canada is the highest credit rating in the world, and we're a very small part of that. But they're looking at us all the time, and they're concerned about us. And the problem is, as our credit rating goes down, our interest rates are going to go up. And at a certain point, they will go below the point where they are creditworthy for major investors. They'll become what's called junk bonds. And then there's the issue of, first of all, can we borrow? And at what rates of interest can we borrow? So it's a big, big problem. In terms of the future economy of the province, I want to make just a couple of points. One is that oil and gas, our next developments are going to be in very deep water, they're very far offshore, they're going to be very expensive to develop. And I believe that the royalties that we get from that are going to be quite low. And as an aside, we should not be in the oil business. We should get out of that. It's tremendously risky. We should take our Alberta is not in the oil business. They take their revenues from the royalties, and that's what we should be doing. The other thing about oil and gas is because of climate change, there's tremendous pressure to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Two ideas that I have as to what we might be able to do. And the first of these is that we need to get our House of Assembly involved in this, and we are in a minority position. What we should do is we should appoint multi-party select committee of the House of Assembly to look at rate mitigation and to go around the province to seek expert advice and to provide a report. We need to make rate mitigation a non-partisan issue. That's what we need to do. That's the first thing we need to do. The second important thing that we need to do is we need to do what Alberta's done. And when the new government of Alberta came in, they established a task force of eminent citizens. It was actually headed by Janice McKinnon, who was a former Minister of Finance under the Romano NDP government many years ago. She's still very active. Because the thing that we need to do is we need to convince people that we have a problem. Because we're going to have to make very, very hard decisions here, and they're going to need to be made as much as possible on a non-partisan basis. I'm just reading a recent book on appeasement before the Second World War. And of course there, when they had a war cabinet, they brought in the Labour Party into their war cabinet, and they had a national government. And it may well come to that in Newfoundland, that we need to do that. And thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
It was my daughter's birthday. She was blowing out the candles on her cake when we heard coming from the TV. So we stopped and listened, and it helped us get to safety. That's why when I think of my daughter's birthday, because now she gets to keep having them.